Good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to Referral Methods for HOME-ARP Non-Congregate Shelter. We are joined today by David Jones in the Office of Affordable Housing, I'm Elisa Hupp, and I'm also joined by Andela Nesbitt Rodriguez, who is my co-host and co-presenter. We are technical assistance providers with the company ICF. So we've met many of you in our work on HOME-ARP, and I'm looking forward to meeting many more of you. Quickly, though, I'm going to hand it over to David for a brief introduction, and then we'll get into the agenda for the day.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to just welcome everyone again. I'm so glad to see some of the numbers for attendees popping up here, and I'm glad that we've got this many coming in, because I know that allocation plans are in, and folks did a great job meeting that deadline, and we're transitioning now into guidance and TA products that are going to start digging deeper into the minutia and hopefully provide you with a HOME-ARP toolbox, so to speak, to start getting into some of these. And today is really going to dig into some referral methods for non-congregate shelter that we're hoping is going to let you know what you can do locally and what you might not want to do locally. So again, welcome, and I will turn it back over and we'll get started. And just be on the lookout for additional NCS and other HOME-ARP TA products that will be coming out now on a very regular basis, geared towards implementation. No longer are we trying to get allocation plans in, but actually getting the projects rolling. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. Okay, so we have a full agenda today. We're going to quickly do an overview of non-congregate shelter. We're going to talk about referral methods. The referral methods for HOME-ARP are the same across activities. Your options are the same, but today the focus and the perspective is on using those referral methods specifically for non-congregate shelter projects that you may put up using your HOME-ARP funds. As part of that, we'll talk about HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, what that means for non-congregate shelter, coordinated entry with other referral methods, and then project or activity waiting list. And then, like Kate said at the end, we will have some time for questions. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the question box. We will kind of monitor them, but we won't be answering them until the end of the session. Okay, and with that, let's jump in. So quickly, as a reminder, HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter has a specific meaning through the HOME-ARP notice. So the HOME-ARP implementation notice specifically defines non-congregate shelter as one or more buildings that will provide private units or rooms within unit sanitary facilities that will be used as temporary shelter for individuals and families. So those units do not require occupants to sign a lease or an occupancy agreement. Specifically, this means private units or rooms. So it's just a kind of really important caveat under non-congregate shelter for HOME-ARP, including in-room bathrooms and showers. And HOME-ARP funding is only intended to be used to acquire and develop non-congregate shelter. It's not intended to be used for operating emergency shelter. 100% of the non-congregate shelter units developed with HOME-ARP funding must benefit qualifying populations, or QPs, as we'll often refer to them throughout this presentation. And you, our PJs, are required to provide access to all 4 HOME-ARP QPs, qualifying populations, unless a limitation was specified in your allocation plan. So I want to also kind of take a second to let everyone know that as we're speaking today, we're kind of presenting 2 PJs. So when we say you, generally we mean the PJ. If you are a COC or an entitlement community that has joined us today, we welcome you, and we're excited for you to learn more about non-congregate shelter. Just know that the requirement that we're talking about is specifically for the PJ. So as a quick reminder, qualifying populations under HOME-ARP, there are 4 specifically defined qualifying populations. HOME-ARP kind of took existing definitions and combined them. So the first one is folks who are homeless as defined under the McKinney-Vento Act, but specifically paragraphs 1, 2, or 3 of the homeless definition. The second qualifying population are those who are at risk of homelessness. And that definition is specifically taken directly as it is from the McKinney-Vento Act. The third QP are persons who are fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. And then the fourth QP are other populations who do not qualify under one of the previous three populations, but they meet one of the following criteria. So either families who are requiring services or housing assistance to prevent homelessness, or they're at greater risk of housing instability. And those are further defined in the HOME-ARP notice, and there are additional resources that go into more detail that we encourage you to look at as you are implementing your HOME-ARP program. Okay, so non-congregate shelter, note on limitations. Limitations are permitted, provided under the HOME-ARP program, provided that the limitation does not discriminate against any protected class. So the following circumstances are required in order to institute a limitation. All qualifying populations must be eligible for at least one activity or project under your HOME-ARP umbrella program. And your needs assessment and your gaps analysis that was completed as part of your allocation planning process needs to document and show a reason for the limitation, a need for the limitation. PJs want to be thoughtful and specific about why and how a limitation is established. If you're establishing a limitation, it must be justified based on the outcomes of your needs and gaps analysis. So for an example, if you learned through your allocation planning process that you have a high number of individuals and families who are fleeing domestic violence, and there's a significant gap in your existing shelter resources for this population, you may want to establish a limitation. As a PJ, you're not required to include a limitation in your allocation plan, but it is an option. And if you do, you must explicitly state that the limitation only impacts, well, if you're establishing it specifically for non-congregate shelter, then it needs to specifically indicate that in your allocation plan. And when soliciting applications for HOME-ARP funding, you want to make it clear if you've established a limitation that it's specifically for non-congregate shelter. We've linked a few resources here. We also add resources at the end, but we wanted to point out that these are kind of good resources that might help you through the understanding of preferences, limitations, and referral methods that will provide context for the overall presentation today. Okay, so we have incorporated knowledge checks throughout this presentation. We're going to launch the first one now. So it should show up on your screen. The question is, HOME-ARP non-congregate shelters must serve all qualifying populations unless the project or activity established an approved limitation in their HOME-ARP allocation plan. So this is a true or false question, and I think it'll either pop up on your screen or you'll see it to the right of your screen in WebEx. So folks can take a second and we'll kind of assess your knowledge about limitations. Okay, so we've gotten quite a few responses. The majority have been true, which is the answer. So unless a limitation is established, access to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter must be granted to all qualifying populations. Establishing a preference or a priority throughout in your allocation plan does not limit access to your non-congregate shelter. Okay. We're going to now switch to HOME-ARP referral methods, and I'm going to hand the presentation over to Andalyn.
All right, thank you so much. All right, let's jump right into HOME-ARP referral methods. So HOME-ARP referral methods is the process to administer HOME-ARP assistance to QPs. So those qualifying populations, I'm going to call them QPs. So as a PJ, when you're selecting a referral method for non-congregate shelter projects, you should choose the method that ensures quick and easy access for all QPs. Access specifically means the ability to apply for or be referred to a HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. So a referral, again, is a recommendation that someone might be appropriate for your shelter project. And a referral indicates that the person has been determined eligible by an initial assessment process. A referral does not guarantee services, but indicates that the following actions have been taken. And I apologize, it would be good if I moved the slide here. Okay, here we go. Um, referral does not guarantee services, but does indicate that the following actions have been taken. So a referral indicates that intake has been done, that there has been an assessment, that there's been prioritization if preferences are established, and that the QP eligibility has been documented. So remember, HOME-ARP is intended to serve all qualifying population that are identified in that HOME-ARP implementation notice at CPD 21-10. So HOME-ARP is new, but it's based on the HOME program. And one area of the HOME statute that's important to understand for this particular conversation is Part A, Subchapter 2, which requires the use of a waiting list to select participants. So a HOME-ARP referral method serves as the method by which you organize all qualifying populations and connect them with the HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter for services. If preferences have been established through your HOME-ARP allocation plan, then your chosen referral method would be how you implement that preference. Be on the lookout for two guides that are going to be coming shortly on the HUD Exchange. One's an introduction to HOME-ARP referral methods and coordinated entry, and the second, is using HOME-ARP referral methods. Those are going to be two really useful guides that are going to be coming to you soon. All right, a few reminders as a PJ, you are responsible for ensuring beneficiaries meet the QP definition and ensuring that they align, that you align any preferences or limitations that are established for your project. For clarity, beneficiaries mean the recipient of shelter, so not those that are referred, but those that are actually going to receive that service or be in the shelter. PJs are not responsible for monitoring assessments, but it behooves you to understand the assessment process for which your chosen referral method, in order to ensure that referrals made to the project do meet those QP definitions in that implementation notice, and they do align with the established preferences and limitations as outlined in your HOME-ARP allocation plan. PJs are permitted to use different referral methods for different projects or activities. So this is really an important point, I think. You are permitted to use different referral methods for different projects or activities. So with your partners, you'll want to discuss how initial assessments are going to be completed, what questions are going to be asked, and what documentation is going to be gathered so that you can move forward with confidence, regardless of the referral method that you choose. Remember that if preferences were not established in your HOME-ARP allocation plan, referrals must be made in chronological order. So that is a waiting list. Referrals must be made in chronological order. All right, so referral method options. There are three options for referral methods. One is HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry as the sole referral method. The other is coordinated entry with other referral methods. And then the last is project or activity non-congregate shelter waiting lists. So this webinar is primarily focused on the first two options. They're HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry and the coordinated entry with other referral methods. So we've specifically added some wording here. We've specifically added HOME-ARP to expanded coordinated entry here to distinguish between what the standard coordinated entry is under the COC rules and what it must become under HOME-ARP if it's to be used as the sole referral method for your HOME-ARP projects. A referral method is the tool that's used to complete the intake. to assess eligibility, to prioritize according to preferences, and to document the eligibility for your HOME-ARP project. The referral method is how you'll identify beneficiaries and implement any established preferences or limitations. This is all through that referral method. Therefore, the HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry means that you're adapting the standard coordinated entry system that's already there in your community, and you're going to use it as a method for implementing priorities for your HOME-ARP projects and activities. And I want to just do a little distinguishing here from projects and activities, right? So your project when you're in IDIS, your project might be HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. That's kind of the umbrella. And your activities are going to be those individual shelters at 123 Main Street or whatever other address. So a project, by project, we mean your overarching your umbrella, and activities are the individual activities there. All right, if preferences are not established, again, referrals must be made in the order that the applications were received. Okay, let's talk about the components of the homeless system here. So there are a few components to the homeless system: access and engagement, crisis response programs, permanent housing, homeless prevention and diversion. The HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter is intended to be a part of the crisis response system in your community. When thinking about how people are going to access HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter, consider the need that HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter fills, and consider how people are going to access homeless services, including emergency shelter. As a PJ, you're going to need to ensure that your chosen referral method works within the homeless system and responds quickly to situations that involve crisis. All right, a few considerations. Limitations and preferences do not dictate your referral method, but they do inform the methods that are available to you. So when deciding on a referral method, ask yourself, were preferences established in the allocation plan? That's going to be a really big component of what you can and can't do. How will you ensure all 4 HOME-ARP QPs have access? Really take a look at your project from the lens of each individual QP. What's the standard coordinated entry referral and prioritization process in your community? Do those prioritizations align with the preferences that are established in your allocation plan? Can the existing coordinated entry expand to serve all 4 QPs? And if so, how will the standard coordinated entry systems provide access and implement uniform referral processes? This is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the deck, but very important. Part of it is a uniform referral process. Does standard coordinated entry cover the same service area as the HOME-ARP project or activity? And if not, how are you planning to fill in the gaps there? So just some considerations and things to think about as you are building your program. All right, and here we are. We're at our knowledge check, another knowledge check. So we're going to pull another poll up on the screen here. Okay, are PJs required to use the same referral method for every project and activity? Let's see, hoping you guys are chomping at the bit, just waiting for this question. Are PJs required to utilize the same referral methods for every project and activity? Okay, and false. Great job. Great job. PJs may choose the referral method that is most appropriate for a specific project or activities. PJs should work with their partners to determine the referral methods that will bring greatest access to the qualifying populations. All right, wonderful. At this point, we're going to keep it going. We're going to roll right into HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, and I'm going to turn it back to Elisa.
Great. Thank you, Andelyn. Okay. So I want to take a minute and just kind of reiterate what Andelyn kind of stated earlier, that we are distinguishing between standard coordinated entry, which is just what is typically known as coordinated entry under the COC program, and HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. They are two different things. HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry is something that builds off of existing coordinated entry. And it kind of begins with your coordinated entry system, and it layers on some requirements that are specific from the HOME-ARP notice and from the HOME-ARP program. So in this section of the presentation, we're going to kind of discuss what the differences are. To get us started, we think it's important to lay some groundwork. Our assumption is that the folks joining us today, a lot of PJs, may have some contact with your COC, you have some familiarity, you've worked with them and coordinated and worked as partners, but you have limited knowledge of what their requirements are, just as they may have limited understanding of what your requirements are under the HOME or HOME-ARP program. So we wanted to provide some context around that. This presentation, we're not going to go into exhaustive detail about coordinated entry, but we are going to outline the essentials that are needed to better understand what HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry really means. So a continuum of care, or a COC, is a regional planning body that's made up of local stakeholders who are focused on preventing and ending homelessness across a geographic area. And that area may or may not neatly align with your designated PJ geography. So in some cases, it may be the same. You have the same boundaries as the COC. Sometimes there are PJs that sit within a COC's geographic region. And then sometimes PJs overlap with multiple COC. And so, as a PJ, you may have 2 or 3 continuums that you are working with who each have their own coordinated entry system. COCs are intended to ensure that people who are in need of housing are connected to housing programs fast, and that people in the community can maintain housing. And while they receive funding from HUD specifically for these housing activities, supportive housing activities, their mandate is a little bit larger than just the funding that they receive for housing programs. They are also asked by HUD and required by HUD to ensure that there's a system-wide effort that incorporates multiple funding sources for housing, so not just COC funding, into what is called the coordinated entry system. In the slides, we've provided a link to a previous webinar that gives a more thorough overview of the continuum of care, and a more comprehensive explanation of homeless services and the roles of COCs. So we do encourage you to take a look at that as well. So understanding what a COC is, what exactly is coordinated entry, right? So coordinated entry is it's an umbrella term for a centralized or a coordinated process established by the COC that prioritizes people who are most in need of assistance for homeless services. Again, as we're referring to that as standard CE in this webinar and in other HOME-ARP related products. Standard CE policies identify people who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. They prioritize different households with histories of unsheltered homelessness or persons who are chronically homeless based on assessments that they have created for their coordinated entry system. The coordinated entry system helps COCs understand and organize the data that they have available to them on who is experiencing homelessness in their community, and it provides them information that helps them strategically allocate their housing resources. Essentially, the coordinated entry system is the method that COCs are using to implement preferences that have been identified through their assessment process. Coordinated entry has specific core elements. This slide specifically references the standard coordinated entry requirements and core elements that PJs need, you really want to take time to understand in order to make an informed decision in partnership with your COC or COCs, depending on the geography that you're in, about whether standard coordinated entry should become HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry for entry to be used as a referral and assessment system for your non-congregate shelter projects. So the core elements of a COC standard coordinated entry system include access, assessment, so gathering the information and assessing housing needs, preferences, and vulnerability. Prioritization, this is the process of organizing that information that is gathered through the assessment and then making referrals and referring those referrals to housing programs. When someone is experiencing a housing crisis, they typically connect with the standard coordinated entry system, and they're assessed for various housing programs within the community. Oftentimes it is always for permanent supportive housing programs that are COC funded. It will also include ESG funded programs. In many communities, it will also include other programs that are maybe potentially state funded or funded with other resources, but they are housing oriented programs specifically for people who are experiencing homelessness. So standard coordinated entry organizes that assessment data, it identifies people for programs, and it ranks them in order of the priority needs determined locally. From there, referrals are made to various projects and programs. And this process enables communities to make more effective referrals. It allows communities to prioritize access to programs for those who are most vulnerable and have the most need. It reduces project wait times and paperwork, and it simplifies applications for participants. So HUD standard coordinated entry requirements ensure that local systems meet the core elements of required by HUD for coordinated entry, including creating a process to prioritize the most vulnerable persons, ensuring access to emergency services during off hours. So for example, emergency shelter intakes are not permitted to be limited to Monday through Friday if emergency shelter is accessed through the coordinated entry system. Coordinated entry ensures access points are accessible to individuals with disabilities. The application process has to be simplified with multiple ways to complete an application. And coordinated entry addresses the needs of individuals and families who are fleeing domestic violence. So again, as a PJ, if you are considering using coordinated entry in any way as a referral into your HOME-ARP program, which you should be having those conversations with your COCs, you want to ensure success by approaching your COC as an active partner and asking them for a conversation about how the coordinated entry system in your community works, asking them questions, asking about their role and the requirements of their program, ask them what their preferences are, what the intake process looks like. So all of those things, those conversations will help you better understand how coordinated entry works, how housing programs are accessed in your community, and how emergency shelter is accessed in your community, which is going to be really important for you as you develop non-congregate shelter. HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry means something different. It takes coordinated entry and then it builds upon it. So it means that the COC has agreed to expand their standard coordinated entry system to all HOME-ARP qualifying populations. What's really important to note here is that standard coordinated entry is typically it's always serving folks who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. Some communities may have expanded it to serve additional populations. HOME-ARP qualifying populations include that third and fourth QP. So the third QP are folks who are fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And it takes the fourth paragraph of the homeless definition and kind of expands it to folks experiencing fleeing human trafficking. And so it's a little bit broader. And it also takes away the requirement that they don't have additional resources. So it's the definition is slightly different under HOME-ARP. And then there's the fourth QP. And so the fourth QP are households who maybe were previously homeless and are housed, but they are receiving assistance and that assistance is ending, and without continued assistance, they may become homeless again. And then there's a second subset of that fourth qualifying population, those who would benefit greatly from supportive services and would prevent homelessness. But the definitions are unique and specific, and they are different from standard coordinated entry requirements for eligibility. So under HOME-ARP expanded CE, essentially your COC is saying, okay, we're going to expand access of our coordinated entry system, and we're going to take applications from all HOME-ARP qualifying populations. And then by doing this, the newly expanded coordinated entry system will be the only process that we're going to use to make referrals into this HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter that we're establishing. As a PJ, you'll want to remember that standard coordinated entry employs a method of prioritization to implement preferences for services. It means that you're agreeing to employ that same method of prioritization that exists under coordinated entry to your HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry is a tool that you'll use then to complete an intake, assess eligibility, prioritize applications, and document eligibility for HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter project. Okay, so saying that you are using HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry as your only referral method into non-congregate shelter means quite a bit. It means that you are expanding coordinated entry, changing it. It is now going to accept all HOME-ARP qualifying populations and be your primary or your only access point to that non-congregate shelter project. So this is just a reminder that HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry is optional, and that the standard coordinated entry requirements remain in place. They don't go away because it's become HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. So the COC is still required to comply with COC requirements. To move forward with this option, you'll want to have identified preferences in your allocation plan and make sure that those preferences align with the COC preferences. And then COCs will have to expand their standard coordinated entry, and they'll want to make sure that their preferences align with the HOME-ARP preferences. So there's a lot of communication going on between the PJ and the COC in order to make this an effective option. Okay, so if you are going to use HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, there are some requirements from the HOME-ARP notice that you need to abide by. If it's going to be your only referral source into non-congregate shelter, it has to expand to include all HOME-ARP qualifying populations. And then you have to agree with the COC and that the preferences and prioritization criteria applied by the COC through their standard coordinated entry system are now going to be used for that HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter and implemented through the newly created HOME-ARP expanded CE. PJs need to establish policies that will account for any geographic boundary differences. So again, we talked earlier about how some PJs sit within a larger COC geographic region. Some PJs, your boundaries align exactly with the COC. If you are a PJ that is larger and you intersect with multiple continuum of care boundaries, then you'll need to be clear about people who reside outside of a particular boundary will access your non-congregate shelter, and this may mean that you are actually pulling in different referral methods. So you're going to use coordinated entry and other referral methods, or it may mean working with multiple COC and multiple standard and coordinated entry systems. As a PJ, these are kind of conversations that you'll need to think about and have with your partners. Regardless of efforts to align preferences and expand standard coordinated entry to HOME-ARP qualifying populations, establishing HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry as your direct referral method, it might not always be feasible. So the notice identifies specific circumstances in which HUD requires that you utilize an additional referral method in cases where expanding coordinated entry is just simply not going to be sufficient for making referrals into the HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter program. So other referral methods are required when the COC does not have enough people in standard coordinated entry to fill your NCS project. I want to make a note here, though, and can be specific that it is a requirement of your allocation planning process that you do a needs assessment, and that needs assessment and gaps analysis must have indicated that there was sufficient need for non-congregate shelter if you have determined that you were going to use your HOME-ARP funds to create non-congregate shelter. So if you then later determine that the standard coordinated entry system does not have enough qualifying people to refer to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter, as a PJ, you really want to take the time to identify a referral method other than standard C, but the bigger, I think the bigger thing is going to be communicating with partners in your community and working with your stakeholders to re-examine the gaps analysis that you've done in the needs assessment and your overall planned use of HOME-ARP funds. The notice also requires that if the COC is not willing or able to expand standard coordinated entry to include all HOME-ARP QPs, that other referral methods be used. Or if the COC does not agree to provide access or implement uniform referral processes for the whole geographic area, if you are a smaller, or if you are a larger PJ that maybe is intersecting with multiple continuums of care, if you are working with one COC and you want to use their coordinated entry system and they maybe have agreed to expand it to all qualifying populations, but they haven't agreed to expand the reach of that coordinated entry system to cover your full geographic area, then you need to make sure that you're working with the other COCs that you intersect with and either working with them on their coordinated entry system to expand it to all qualifying populations as well, or you're identifying other referral methods that will cover those geographic areas. Okay, we have another knowledge check for you. Should pop up in a second. All right, the question. So is HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry required? True or false question. We'll give everyone a second to answer. Okay, so true or false? So false. And that is correct. The majority answered false, which is correct. So expanded coordinated entry for HOME-ARP qualifying populations is optional. It's a decision that as a PJ you should be making with COC partners. It's not a decision that as a PJ you can make on your own. Okay, so let's, okay. We are going to, Annalyn, I'm passing back to you. Oh, okay, there we go. I think I got confused for a second. I lost control of the presentation bubble, so I got confused for a second. There we go. All right, so let's see.
You actually had just a couple more slides.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Slide 20. I don't know if my screen froze or it was just dragging a little bit. Okay. So considerations for HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. If you're expanding standard coordinated entry to include all HOME-ARP populations, it's complex, but if you're interested in having that conversation, there are some distinct advantages that PJs and their partners COCs might want to consider. HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry has the potential to ensure that priority and preference alignment is made across communities, and it can create a streamlined community-wide process and system for accessing shelter and housing resources, which could be, as a great benefit to folks who are experiencing homelessness and to all qualifying populations within your community, because it can grant streamlined access to not just HOME-ARP projects, or your HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter project, but to other housing resources within the community. So again, it can make accessing the shelter, non-congregate shelter, easier for qualifying populations, especially those who are experiencing homelessness, because it can reduce the burden of navigating multiple applications, especially while experiencing a housing crisis. And it can also ensure that QPs are referred to programs that are most appropriate for their needs. However, there is some tension between the funding requirements. And so it does take a lot of effort and a lot of conversation and commitment between the PJ and the COC to ensure that priorities and preferences are aligned. If there is not careful planning and consideration, there is some risk for the PJ and the COC that they could end up being out of compliance with either HOME-ARP requirements or COC requirements. So, it's something that can certainly be done. It's not an option for every community, but for those communities that there are several communities that could work really well in. I think specifically if there are people in your community who were previously determined ineligible for standard coordinated entry, and you wanted to implement HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, doing outreach to them might become necessary to ensure that they now understand that the system that they previously applied to is going to be accessible to them. And then DV and trafficking survivors and service organizations might be reluctant to participate in HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, and they're not required. So as a PJ, you want to make sure that you're having conversations early on to ensure that the third QP has access to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter if you are planning on using HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. Typically, that means that there is still going to be another referral method, but that other referral method will often kind of mirror the HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry process. But there are, it essentially becomes HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry and another referral method. So like we said, it's a great option, but it's one that should be approached carefully. A lot of the coordination that needs to occur will happen after your allocation plan has been created, but before your non-congregate shelter is fully developed. If you are a community that is interested in this option and you're thinking about it, again, we encourage you to take the time to understand each other's priorities, expectations, and funding requirements. Recognize and understand that there are inherent conflicts that will, create challenges. Different programs have different priorities and goals and funding requirements. And as you're strategizing, you want to make sure to take the time to understand what your partners, what their short and long-term goals are, as well as communicating the short and long-term goals of the non-congregate shelter that you are creating with HOME-ARP. You want to also consider how HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry will be utilized after your funds are no longer available. And COC members should work through some of the complicated processes that come with managing coordinated entry and then expanding and creating HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry with PJs. PJs should become active members of the COC and participate in committees and subcommittees that address things like policies and procedures for coordinated entry, both to increase their knowledge of the local standard coordinated entry process and to monitor the referrals that are made to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. At this stage, you'll want to think about how you'll meet the HOME-ARP documentation requirements, including documenting how QPs are benefited in non-congregate shelter units. And we mentioned kind of like one of the slides earlier that PJs are not required to monitor standard coordinated entry documents, but they are responsible for ensuring that QPs are served and that proof of eligibility is available. So working with the COC and understanding what the documents are that they're gathering can help ensure that you are meeting the documentation requirements for HOME-ARP. And then finally, in many communities, there can be significant financial costs associated with creating HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry. And some of those costs can, a PJ could commit HOME-ARP admin dollars to support COCs with that cost of expanding their coordinated entry. But there's a conversation that needs to be had there. PJs need to be clear about how much funding they have available and what their expectations are for how that funding can be utilized, and COCs need to be clear about the realistic cost of expanding their coordinated entry systems. In some cases, this might mean hiring more staff. In some cases, it might mean purchasing additional equipment, so things like cell phones or computers, and other places it might mean putting up additional access sites. So it might be things like setting up desks or additional offices for coordinated entry assessments. So expanding coordinated entry to include HOME-ARP qualifying populations is complex, but it can be worth the effort in some communities. We can't stress enough that as a PJ, if you are considering this, that you need to work with your COC and make a decision based on local needs and the standard coordinated entry process that's already in place. And so we've included some instances where we think this could work well for consideration. So in places where the PJ and COC geographies align, in places where the long-term plan for non-congregate shelter is to utilize ESG dollars for operations. ESG projects are already required to participate in standard coordinated entry. So there's kind of a nice alignment of goals and requirements there. Standard coordinated entry in places where CE is the primary access point for existing emergency shelter. If you're putting up another shelter in that area or location, then it makes sense that you would incorporate access to that shelter through your coordinated entry system. And in places where your standard coordinated entry system has already expanded to households outside of those who are literally homeless or at risk of homelessness. So the system might already be expanded to accept and do intakes for HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So it might be a little bit easier to meet the HOME-ARP requirements for expanded coordinated entry. Okay. So we do have a 5-minute break planned. We'll start that break now, and then when we come back, I'll pass to Andalyn, and we will pick up with coordinated entry and other referral methods.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Hope everybody had a good, quick break. There are lots of great questions in the Q&A. Please keep those coming. We're going to get through all of this information as quickly as we can so that we have lots of time, hopefully, to get to your questions. All right. So we're going to go right into coordinated entry with other referral methods now. So coordinated entry with other referral methods means that as a PJ, you will utilize the standard coordinated entry as a referral option into non-congregate shelter, but other referral sources will also be utilized. Therefore, standard coordinated entry doesn't have to expand to accept all 4 HOME-ARP QPs. Other referral options will be used to identify non-congregate shelter QPs as well. Coordinated entry with other referral methods is necessary when the PJ has identified preferences in the allocation plan, but those preferences do not align with the priorities that are identified by the standard coordinated entry that's already happening in your community. Using other referral methods means standard coordinated entry does not have to expand because overall, all 4 QPs can still gain access to the HOME-ARP activity through either the coordinated entry system or through those other referral methods that you're going to identify. And we're going to talk about those other referral methods in just a moment. So additionally, using other referral methods means that standard coordinated entry, again, doesn't have to expand, but all 4 QPs must have access through to the activity. All right, so I just said we're going to talk about those other referral methods, and here they are. Some other referral methods refers to another established process for identifying QPs. So this could be a wait list organized by the PJ, or it could be other existing referral systems that serve HOME-ARP QPs. A coordinated entry with other referral methods allows PJs to utilize the standard coordinated entry system that's already there and build on the coordination work that COCs have already done. It allows PJs to meet the HOME-ARP requirements for serving all 4 QPs without, again, expanding that coordinated entry. And it creates the opportunity for PJs to institute prioritization for preferences that are different from those established by your local COC and standard coordinated entry. So lots of benefits there to coordinated entry with other referral methods as well. So some examples of other referral methods include established referral systems that are established through local mental and public health departments for accessing shelter and services that are designed specifically for persons living with disabilities. Could include referral systems in place for veteran services that are already there and established in your community. And it could include a traditional wait list that permits qualifying populations to apply directly and permits service providers to make referrals. Any of those are just some examples of other referral methods that might be available to you. So requirements for coordinated entry with other referral methods include that the PJs ensure that they fully understand and approve any preferences or prioritization criteria applied by the COC. If you're using standard coordinated entry, you have to make sure that those preferences and prioritizations match yours or that you're filling in any gaps. So fully understand and approve any preferences or prioritization criteria that's applied by the COC. PJs should approve any criteria applied by other referral sources as well. Any preferences or prioritization criteria utilized by another referral source must align with what's in your allocation plan. Because this option means that there are multiple referral methods going on in your non-congregate shelter program, you're going to need to establish policies and procedures that ensure uniform processes. This is really important. This means that you're going to need to ensure that all HOME-ARP QPs have access, taking into consideration any limitations that are established in your allocation plan. And you're going to need to ensure that the process for applying is the same regardless of their starting points, regardless of the referral method that they're starting from, that the application process is the same. Finally, as a PJ, you're going to want to be specific about what the other referral methods are. So is it a waiting list operated by the PJ? Are there other coordinated access points that are going to collect QP information and refer the project? Again, use the same or a very similar application and complete the same HOME-ARP assessment. So make sure you have those uniform processes in place and that there's consistency across all of the referral methods that go into your project. To ensure success with this option, procedures and written agreements should include parameters that address immediate shelter access, shelter utilization, and management of the waiting list if one is used. Depending on the preferences identified in the allocation plan, the PJ may need to consider additional referral methods to ensure that all 4 HOME-ARP QPs have access and that the preferences are being applied fairly. PJs need to devote the same kind of level, same level of planning and coordination to other designated referral methods as they do to coordinating with the COCs and standard coordinated entry. I know Elisa spoke a little bit earlier about planning with your COCs. That is extremely important, but so is other referral methods, and make sure that you're dedicating as much time to that as well. This is going to include looking at staffing and costs related to administering those referral methods. Doing that's going to ensure that referrals are appropriate for the project or activity and feasible for the lifetime of the activity. All right, so PJs need to be aware that you cannot require victim services providers to use HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry to access HOME-ARP developed non-congregate shelters. PJ should work closely with the COC and victim service providers to identify referral methods for survivors that ensure that the privacy and the needs of the victim are fully met. That's number one. Domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, qualifying populations have equal access to HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. That's really important. So need to ensure that the privacy and the needs of the victims are fully met, and that those qualifying population, those people in that group, have equal access to non-congregate shelter. Agreeing to expand coordinated entry to HOME-ARP QPs does not guarantee that it will be an effective referral method for survivors. Therefore, PJs must be prepared to offer an alternative referral method. In some communities, the COCs may have already identified separate referral methods for survivors, and PJs may want to consider using that as their other referral method. Coordination with local stakeholders is going to be really important to ensuring survivors have equal access to your HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. The coordinated entry and other referral methods may work really well in communities where preferences in the allocation plan don't completely align with the standard coordinated entry that's already there, especially if there are multiple priorities or limitations that are identified by the PJ in that HOME-ARP allocation plan. Also, in communities where standard coordinated entry won't be expanded to all QPs, that other referral methods is certainly a way to fill in that gap. And standard coordinated entry does not if standard coordinated entry doesn't have enough people to fill in your HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter, then certainly other referral methods is a way to, again, fill in that gap. Domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking survivors, that QP would need to utilize a separate referral method in order to make sure that privacy and safety needs are met. Okay, and now we are at another knowledge check. Time to test our knowledge again. All right, and here's our poll. PJs must align preferences with the COC to utilize standard coordinated entry or other referral methods. Is that true or false? Must PJs align preferences with the COC to utilize standard coordinated entry and other referral methods? Okay, just waiting on that poll. All right, and no. No, the answer is false. If preferences don't align with the standard coordinated entry, standard coordinated entry may make referrals to a waiting list that's established by the PJ. The waiting list can then assess, prioritize, and refer the HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter according to the preferences that are established in the allocation plan. So don't necessarily need to um, um, align preferences with the COC. The COC can make referrals to the waiting list, and you can assess, prioritize, and refer people through that waiting list there. All right, now we're going to go into talking a little bit more about the project and activity wait list, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elisa.
Great. Thank you, Andalyn. Okay, so we are nearing the end, but before we get there, we want to talk about project and activity waiting list. So this is the third referral method option. This is a more straightforward option. As home PJs, we expect that many of you are very familiar with the requirements for a project or activity waiting list. The HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter requirements for project or activity waiting lists are essentially the same as the requirements under home. But there are some things that we want to point out. And even though this is a kind of more familiar referral method option, we want to stress that it does take, an equal amount of thoughtfulness and planning. Your policies and procedures still need to address this referral method option and make sure that you've thoroughly thought through the process. So individuals and families who are assessed and referred for services in chronological order or in accordance with any of the preferences that are established by the PJ under a project or activity waiting list. Any organization might refer to a project or activity wait list, as well as any individual or household. They can apply directly. And then under a waiting list, QPs are provided easy access to the application and to status updates. One of the things, kind of an example that we've used before around providing easy access to the application and status updates and ensuring that all QPs have access to a waiting list, is that communication with applicants can't be conducted solely through mailing. So one thing to remember is that the people you are serving HOME-ARP qualifying populations may not have consistent mailing addresses. For each of the QPs, there is some level of something about that definition that indicates that that household is experiencing a housing crisis. And so your standard mailing list to communicate access to non-congregate shelter is not going to be an effective way to reach every household. So these are just kind of some considerations around using a project or activity waiting list. A waiting list has its advantages, and those include being able to use it regardless of any preferences, prioritization methods, or limitations that you've established for your non-congregate shelter. So, a waiting list can be organized in any way that you need to organize it according to the preferences and prioritizations that you identified in your allocation plan. The waiting list method also ensures that your non-congregate shelter will be available to all HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So it allows you to check that, that box for compliance, and if you have not established limitations, and it provides you with an opportunity to do outreach to all qualifying populations to ensure that they are aware of the waitlist and can access it. And this method doesn't require changes to your standard coordinated entry system, but COCs can still utilize the standard coordinated entry system to make referrals to the waiting list. So it could be potentially a nice way to partner with your COC and to allow them to gather information from their coordinated entry system and use that information to make referrals to your HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter waitlist. Okay, when using a waiting list, the initial assessment might be less comprehensive than the standard COC or other referral methods. So there is a greater burden on the project to determine eligibility once a referral is made. Additionally, PJs should be thoughtful about their written policies and their written agreements. They want to make sure, or as a PJ, you want to make sure that you're providing immediate shelter access to households who are in crisis. And so you want to make sure that your policies do not include processes that prevent or that create cumbersome application processes or prevent immediate access to non-congregate shelter. when it's applicable to you as a PJ, you want to identify a process for providing services to qualifying populations who might be able to preserve their housing rather than entering HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. I did see a question, which we'll get to in the Q&A session, but a question about households who are not homeless, so not the QP definitions. There are 4 different QP definitions, and not all of them indicate that the household is literally homeless according to HUD's McKinney-Vento definition. And so you want to make sure, one thing that you as a PJ will have to think through is unless you've established a limitation, you're required to provide access to all qualifying populations. And if you have not identified preferences, then you cannot automatically move folks who are experiencing literal homelessness according to the QP1 to the top of that list. So that could indicate that there are people on your list who maybe are in housing already, who have applied for non-congregate shelter. So one thing you want to think through as a PJ is, what services do we have in place? Do we have any additional options that we can provide to that household to keep them housed rather than them exiting housing and entering non-congregate shelter? And as a PJ, you'll want to think through guidelines that will ensure that your non-congregate shelter operates within your local homelessness crisis response system. You want to be thoughtful about where your non-congregate shelter sits within that system, how it interacts with other services and programs. And you want to, as much as possible, incorporate that into your policies and procedures as you're thinking through how folks will access non-congregate shelter, especially under the use of a project or activity waiting list. Okay, and with that, we are going to move on. We have one more final knowledge check. Should pop up any second. If you are a PJ using a project or activity waiting list instead of standard coordinated entry participants will not be able to access HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. Is this true or false? We'll give it a minute for folks to have a second to read through the question and answer. Again, the question is, if true or false question, if a PJ uses a project activity waitlist instead of standard coordinated entry participants will not be able to access HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. Is this true or false? And I'll just note that this is the last knowledge check, and we are kind of towards the end of the slide, so we're going to do a summary, and then we'll be able to jump to the Q&A. And we've gotten a lot of really great questions, so we'll be able, hopefully we'll be able to answer as many as possible. But we do have information collected, and so we will hopefully be able to answer. If not today, we'll be able to answer it directly for you. We'll just give it a second for those answers to load and populate. Okay, so the answer is false, and the majority of answers, yes, the majority of answers are false. So standard CE systems can refer participants to a HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter waitlist. The PJ will just then add those names to the waitlist and organize them according to any priorities or limitations that may have been established in your allocation plan. So it is still an option for coordinated entry to kind of make referrals to a waiting list. All right, our summary. I know we've covered a lot of content today. There's a lot of information, and I want to kind of reiterate and stress again that we've talked about referral methods through the lens of using them for non-congregate shelter, but these referral methods apply for all HOME-ARP activities. And so today, we've kind of summarized the referral method is the process that you use to refer qualifying populations to a HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. The referral process is multi-step and includes an intake, an assessment, prioritization if preferences are established, and documenting eligibility. And then when, as a PJ, you are making a decision about which referral method you want to use for non-congregate shelter, there are some decisions that you have to make and some considerations that you should be thinking about. You should be considering any preferences and limitations that you may have established in your allocation plan. You need to communicate with your COC and with homeless service partners and shelter partners within your region, because you want to make sure that HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter is accessible to all qualifying populations. And you'll have to you'll have to establish descriptive policies and procedures that will allow you to ensure that whichever referral method you choose is implemented effectively and efficiently. Okay, and with that, we are on to the questions portion. So we have just about 10 minutes.
Yeah, we have some really great questions waiting. So let's start with preferences versus limitations. I see a lot of chatter about that going back and forth in the boxes. So if a PJ is going to use other referral methods, I assume this would need to be spelled out in the allocation plan. Correct? Let's start there, and then there's another question about preferences and limitations. So
what was the
if a PJ is going to use other referral methods, it would need to be spelled out in the allocation plan, correct?
So oh, great, Kimberly.
Alyssa? Yeah, I answered it in the chat, and we don't require, HUD doesn't require that you describe your referral processes that you might use, but certainly if you wanted to share that in your allocation plan, that is fine, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about, like, we identified one referral method in our allocation plan, and now we're thinking it through, and we have another referral, there's another referral method that we're thinking would be a better fit. That doesn't actually require a substantial amendment, so you can make that change without amending your plan. I want to take a second though and introduce Kim. Kim is with the Office of Affordable Housing as well, and she's a specialist, subject matter expert on limitations and preferences and priorities. And so Kim, thank you, and please jump in. And I think that there may have been something that you wanted to clarify from earlier in the presentation around limitations.
Yes, thank you so much, Alyssa. And also, I just put up a bunch of resources. Some of them are fairly recent, some additional webinars for folks that you might want to just remind yourself of or acquaint yourself with, relating to coordinated entry, how COCs work, and all that kind of good stuff. So the thing about limitations that may be kind of a newer concept for folks is because, we have HOME as the first part of the name of this program, HOME-ARP, is that obviously we have the fair housing and civil rights requirements that trickle down to HOME-ARP. And one thing that we can't have with NCS is, single adult only NCS, right? It has to be for both families and single adults. And I know in the recent past, that was a little bit of a shock because we have other programs that do actually allow for congregate shelter to be for, one group or another, but that's not the case with HOME-ARP. So I want to call that out. That would be, a violation of our fair housing and civil rights laws. So just want to make sure that that is very clear. And the other thing, though, is that when we talk about DV, as Alyssa was mentioning earlier, if you've established that there was that need, there's a gap there, and that the NCS might be for DV, that would be fine, as long, again, as you have established that as a preference in your allocation plan. And if you haven't, you can come back in through the substantial amendment and update us on that. We will, the field office will kind of do a more in-depth review than they normally would with, say, a substantial amendment for a CDBG changes to your action plan. But so those are just some things to keep in mind when we talk about NCS preferences and limitations. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great. And so I do want to, Annalyn, I know we had the questions in order, but there is a question about substantial amendments to the allocation plans. And since Kim just mentioned that, I'll jump to that question. The question is about what triggers a substantial amendment, and do changes to preferences or referral sections trigger that. That may have been actually the same question, Annalyn, or it's at least similar to the question that you just posed, but I wanted to point out that in the HOME-ARP notice, if you look at page 16, and it's number 6 on page 16, substantial amendments to the HOME-ARP allocation plan, and that will outline specifically what constitutes a substantial amendment. But it's basically, in short, if you're changing the purpose, scope, location, or beneficiaries of an activity, including identifying new preferences not previously described in your plan, then you need to do a substantial amendment. Okay, and then with that, I think we'll go back to going in order.
Why would someone from other QPs require non-congregate shelter? They're currently housed.
So I think this is a great question. I think one thing you have to remember is that eligibility for non-congregate shelter is not based on, it's not solely based on someone's qualifying under the homeless definition that you previously have used under the COC or ESG world. So literally homeless. What makes someone eligible for HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter is that they meet a qualifying population definition. And so you want to go back and take a look at those qualifying population definitions. Each one of those definitions indicates that the household is experiencing some type of housing crisis. And so that would be, essentially it's up to, if they are applying for non-congregate shelter, then they have determined that their housing crisis constitutes that they might need this assistance. And it's when you are doing intakes and assessments, what you want to be sure that you're doing is that you're not making a determination about someone's need for emergency shelter, but you are making a determination about whether or not they meet a qualifying population definition. So it's not up to the PJ to say someone needs or does not need shelter. It's up to you to determine, do they meet the qualifying population definition? And if we've established preferences, do they meet those preferences?
I want to ask this question because it's come up a couple times in different ways. Will the expanded coordinated entry system for HOME-ARP also apply for permanent supportive housing being established through HOME-ARP funding? And, would also apply for permanent supportive housing? Will it apply for all the other eligible activities under HOME-ARP?
So, I mean, yes, essentially kind of what we covered today applies. So for HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry, that applies for all of the activities. So if you're using HOME-ARP expanded coordinated entry for rental housing, for example, you're still required to expand it to include all qualifying populations. You need to be specific about, in your policies and procedures about what that referral process will look like. So all of that is still applicable. What I think is important today is that you recognize that we're using the view of through the lens of providing access to non-congregate shelter, but a lot of the information could be applicable to other activities as well. There are, Annalyn mentioned and earlier in the presentation, there are 2 products, that kind of guides that are being released. They should be on the HUD Exchange, I would say, within 1 to 2 weeks. So keep an eye out for them. And they are specific on referral methods across all activities. And so that'll kind of provide a little bit more guidance. It's not just through the lens of non-congregate shelter.
And if I could jump in there, I'm not sure if that question was getting at, is there one that you have to pick for every single activity, HOME-ARP activity that you're doing, which you don't. You could have a separate you could be using, just a standard wait list for something, and you could be using coordinated entry for something. So I'm not sure if that was where the question was around, do we have to pick one way of doing it and use it across the board for all of our different homework activities? I'm not sure if that, and I don't want to confuse that, because they would have options to use different methods based on the project.
Can I just jump in for a second too? Because I think you really do want to think about using different methods. Because I know the focus is not rental housing today, but NCS. But with rental housing, we have a long-term affordability period. So you'd be kind of locked in with the expanded CE potentially for 1 or 2 projects, right? For the long term, if you were using expanded CE. Whereas maybe it makes more sense to use standard CE with other referral methods, or just a project wait list for those particular, certain rental housing activities. So I definitely kind of give it some thought. And then also, I think I'm just going to add, I think it's a really good idea to sit down with the COC advisory board to understand exactly how their CE system works. Before you decide how you want to use it, if you do. And then the other thing that we didn't really cover too much today, but is very important, is that the PJ needs to actually execute some kind of an agreement with the COC advisory board to explicitly describe those actions that the COC will implement through its CE.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. If the PJ does not have a preference in the allocation plan, can the grantee prioritize based on the population that the shelter serves?
So again, if you haven't identified a preference in your allocation plan, then you can't institute a preference later. So prioritization, moving people, kind of, putting one group of people over, providing access to them over another group of people, is essentially, it's the same thing as a preference. And so if you haven't identified that in your allocation plan, but the shelter provider that you've identified has, a prioritization method, then you need to have a conversation with them about not using that prioritization, or amending your allocation plan so that you're being clear about what the preferences are that you are, would like to institute, or that they historically have used.
Is there a requirement for each individual in a congregate unit to have their own in-room bath or shower?
Yes. Each unit, not each individual in a unit. So if it is a household with multiple people, then there only has to be one in-unit bathroom. But there is a requirement that there is a private in-unit bathroom with a toilet and a tub or a shower in each non-congregate shelter unit that you're developing.
That's it. We are at 4 o'clock. We got some really great questions. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. I'll turn it back over to Elisa now.
Yeah, so with that, we'll wrap. This will be posted on the HUD Exchange. Thank you to David and Kimberly as well for your participation today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.